Okay, welcome to the podcast Mystical Connections, Let Your Life Speak. My name is Tom Wolfe. I'm a Quaker Christian minister. What we'll be doing is using the method that William Penn perfected in the 17th century of taking a Christian principle and going through other scripture to find out where they agreed with Jesus. And we'll be doing 33 principles that come from an Eastern mystic named Meher Baba. So we're now in episode 6. And our guest again is Pastor Joel. So we're going to pick up as we worked in episode 5 on proper conduct, 12 ways of realizing God. We're now, there are 12 of those ways of realizing God, and we're on number 7. So we're just going to continue where we left off in episode 5 with principle number 7, which is control through love. When your love for God drives away your lust for the things of the senses, then you will realize God. And from Christian scripture, because you got 2 Christian pastors here, from Galatians 5:16 is a quote, "This I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh." And James 1:12-14 says, "Blessed is the man that endures temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to them that love him. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither does he tempt any man, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away by his own lust and enticed." And finally, Romans 8:6 says, "To be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace." So how would we define love? Easy question, Pastor.
Oh, yeah.
It's been done so well in the past.
Right.
So how would we...
Under 1,000 words, right?
You're right. So how would we define love?
Love is... I would start here, and I'll start talking, and eventually it'll start making sense. Love, for me, is the act of, it's more than a feeling, because there are feelings associated with love for sure, but it's the act of doing something for someone else that is without strings, that is a gift, and it is your gift that you can give to them for their betterment, in which whether you get anything in return or not is not that important. It's not the purpose or the goal. I think that's one way of. So I'll stop there because I've got other thoughts about love, but I want to hear.
Well, you
what
actually
have to say about that.
Literally took the words right out of my mouth. What I was going to say was, all the thinking I've done about love and all the books I've read, which, I'm a reader, that love is serving without expectation of reward. And serving, if you can do it, it's not easy. From what would make the other person happy, even at the sacrifice of your own happiness. That's how I would define love. But it's without expectation of reward. And that also... a lot of times this whole praying for abundance or the gospel of abundance, but I don't buy it. I think that loving God is also the same principle, that we love God not out of expectation of reward, but because God is worthy of love and God is love incarnate. And just because God is love, you love, it's not because you want something from God, it's because you're loving love itself.
Yeah.
If that works for you.
Yeah, and I think I would also say in terms of relationships, love is not only a gift that I give without expectation, but it's also my ability to accept people as they are, the totality of who they are.
Yeah.
The darkness, the light,
darkness and
the good, the bad, without demand, let they change and become what I think they should be. It's that ability to accept and embrace, not a tolerance from a distance, but a tolerance from up close.
Yeah, tolerance from intimacy.
Yeah, yeah. Which is extraordinarily difficult.
Difficult, yes.
So read that principle again, the conduct principle.
The principle here from the 33 principles of Meher Baba is control through love. When your love for God drives away your lust for the things of the senses, then you will realize God.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's talking about self-control, like the control through love, being controlled by love, maybe then as opposed to being controlled by lusts. Yeah, man, that itself could be another
whole podcast.
oh man, there's so much to be said about that, because I think immediately in the Christian scriptures of that same passage, Galatians chapter 5, in there the Apostle Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, speaks of the fruit of the Spirit. I mean, it's very contextual, that passage, because it's totally right on. It fits very well with this whole theme throughout that book, where he's making the case that we all know we have things that we're trying to work on internally that we're not pleased by, that tend to control our ourselves. They're impulses, their desires that we can't really get rid of. And he says, well, you can, essentially you've tried the rules method of trying to control the self. How's that gone?
Yeah, how's that working for you?
How's that working
for you? Yeah.
Not very well. And he actually tells the Galatian church, don't keep doing that. That is not working, and that is not what you learned through the gospel, as he refers to it as. And then he says, but here is the way forward. And then he lists what he calls the fruit of the Spirit, having the Spirit within us, which begins with love. And ends with self-control. So it's an interesting, the book ends to the list of fruit that he has there. And I think, and I did recently think of that, like, it's interesting that self-control is the last fruit that's listed there. Because ultimately that sort of is where it begins. It begins with love. And if we can fully be released in love to God, then there's this thing that happens, which is self-control. But the thing that I used to think self-control was that
active will,
act of the will.
Yeah.
That's it. Like really, you've got to have willpower to dominate this thing. And we know today it doesn't really work. But the release of oneself to the love of God, complete love of God for you, is. It just at that point, I think, when you can fall onto grace that way, just here's who I am, here's all of my darkness, here's all of my issues, my struggles, my weakness, and then experience God having no condemnation whatsoever towards you, just pure love. That it completely undermines everything that the darkness within you is trying to achieve, and so. It produces the result is the fruit, which is interesting because I've said to people before, like you think of the tree, the analogy of the tree producing fruit. The tree doesn't try to push out a fruit. It's the result of having been planted, and then as you're planted in God, then the production is natural, that the result is self-control that is produced from that. So, So I mean, this is sort of the conceptual component of it, but yeah, I think if I think of my own life where I've struggled with parts of me that I didn't particularly like, that I could see were damaging to myself and damaging to relationships around me, and I remember one that my wife and I had for a long time, and eventually. I realized that a lot of what I was trying to do, and I didn't even know this, was I was trying to earn her love because I never could understand why she had loved me to begin with. But that never occurred to me until years into the marriage, and that's when I saw it. I thought, I'm trying to work for her love, and it's producing all kinds of really dysfunctional behavior in me, So being able to yield to her love for me was an act of yielding to God's love for me. And then the self-control was not something out of an act of will. It was just that issue is no longer an issue. Like, I have control of that now. And yeah.
All I have to say is I can't improve on anything Pastor said, so we're going to move on to the next one. Okay, the next one is selfless service. Principle number 8 on 12 ways of realizing God. If you have the quality of selfless service unaffected by results, similar to that of the sun, which serves the world by shining on all creation, on the grass in the field, on the birds in the air, on the beasts in the forest, on all mankind with its sinner and saint, its rich and its poor, unconscious of their attitude toward it, then you will win God. So we have here 1 John 3, 18 through 19. My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. And by this we shall know that we are of the truth, and shall assure our hearts before him. And then I always think of, faith without works is dead. I'm not, maybe you know where that is in the gospel, Pastor.
Yeah.
Same idea that you have to act. But I am interested in what your response would be, and I'm thinking about my own, about all these different things that are unconscious of the sun's attitude toward them, but the sun still shines on all of them. The sun shines because it's nature to shine, not because you're good enough or it shines on everything.
Yeah, it's not meritorious.
Yeah, thank you. It's not meritorious, yeah.
Yeah.
So it says, if you have the quality of selfless service, with that analogy, you will win God.
Yeah, well, you talk about faith without works, I think it's, that's the thing that's interesting to me about that ability to give, right? To give love to the world, without merit. It's not based upon how the world responds to you. So you have to leave that system entirely, because that system of, you deserve it. That's why you're getting it is not the system that that is a life-giving system. I understand its necessity in the work world, but our own sort of relational activity, I think, needs to continue to lean much more into this idea of this cannot be based on merit. It has to be based on something else. Because at what point does that system, if someone doesn't deserve, first of all, I'm the judge apparently, so I'm the one judging whether someone deserves that love or not, right? So me as judge, that's a lot of weight for me to carry, including my own self. I deserve love or I don't deserve love, right? So it's a lot of weight, and eventually that's crushing. And then there's the other part of it that's not based on merit, but it's based on how much I have of love to be able to give to the world. Like, I myself run out. Like, I'd like to be better, but I just don't have the resources, right? And I think of the passage in 1 John where John says, we love because he first loved us. And that is John taking directly from the teachings of Jesus, where Jesus speaks about this idea of you forgive because you have been forgiven. That's how it starts.
And the more you're forgiven, the more you forgive.
The more you forgive. Sure. If you've genuinely received it. If you don't see it as, I didn't deserve this, but it's gift. The whole thing is gift. Everything in this world is gift. If I don't see it that way, then I won't act that way. Right? It's this world that is that has meager amount of resources, and I have to grab a hold of it. A kind of way of seeing things. So Jesus deals with forgiveness that way. Forgiveness, you receive forgiveness, you give forgiveness. The whole entire way of thinking is reversed in Jesus' life. You don't work, even the apostles afterwards, you don't work for the Sabbath, for rest. You work from the Sabbath. So you learn to live from a place of rest, in other words, instead of trying to eventually get to that place of rest. So I think same thing applies to this as well.
Selfless service.
That selfless service is you have to be one who sees the world as a gift to you. That everything that you see is beautiful and is in the love that you're seeing around you. You're experiencing it first. You're taking it in. You're not looking at it as either I don't understand it, so I push it out, or I must have done something good to deserve this. It's none of that. It's all gift. Now I receive it. I welcome it in. Thank you. I savor it. I don't rationalize it. I just take it in. And then from that, I continue to have resource for the world. So this is unlimited source of love, right? So
like
it's like the sun.
Yeah, it's like the sun.
Yeah.
And one of Mayor Baba's statements is real happiness lies in making other people happy. And so I've gotten this habit of baking early in the morning, and then during that day I can hand out little baked goods, and people, it's almost an endless supply of happiness. And it's just by doing a real simple service. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. Okay, we're going to move on to principle number 9, which is renunciation. And it says, if you renounce for God everything, physical, mental, and spiritual, then you will have God. See?
So what does renunciation mean to you?
So to me, renunciation means it's not that you don't do your worldly duties, but it's to just know that you're putting the larger things first. And you have to renounce the primacy of the smaller things.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose ultimately we'll see where we really do just live in the Spirit of God. But, it's kind of a hard thing to do when you're, running a store that has to make a certain amount of profit. It's not that you let go of that. It's just you don't make it first.
Again, these are words, and they have different, of course, meanings to all of us. Renunciation feels like an act of the will again to me. So it's something that I kind of have this I'm not sure about renunciation, in the sense of okay, here's a list of things that I'm going to renounce, and then follow God, or
that
find
would be
God.
an act of will, sure.
Be an act of will, yeah. So, and I'm not saying that that's what they're saying. I'm just saying that that's what it triggers in my own mind from my own context and upbringing. So that would be the reaction in me. But as I look at, as I think about renunciation, there are ways of being, the ways of thinking, ways of feeling that I no longer hold on to. So that's how that's how I experienced it as well. Is that there's a moving from, at some point I felt like I was politically leaning one way, and then a few years later it was leaning a different way, and then being able to actually see a lot of this whole way of thinking as being of a stage that I can no longer vibe with. It does not work for me at all. It's not even something I find interesting any longer. It's something that I'm engaged in for the sake of people, but it's not something that I find helpful to me or interesting. Instead, I feel like we're moving towards, and that was to me that passage you had quoted from Romans chapter 12, which is do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And I think that's exactly what he's talking about. There's a way of seeing things that is the way the rest of the world sees it. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to change the world, if you're going to have any impact positive in a positive way, you have to actually exit that. Mm-hmm. This is not a thing of this is not a trivial thing for the apostle. It's because he could see differently, and his seeing actually created a lot of trouble for the early people who were following Jesus.
They did not have an easy time of it, for sure.
No, and for them, it just didn't make sense. How could you do what you're doing? You're a Jewish man. You're supposed to be. You're trained as a Hebrew scholar. Why are you now speaking to non-Jews and welcoming them into this thing called the faith?
You're talking about Paul.
I'm talking about Paul, yeah. And for Paul, it seems like his seeing has expanded. His seeing has increased.
He can't go back.
He can't go back.
Yeah.
And I think that's the transformation of the mind. I think that's the renunciation of a previous way of seeing. And you're able to look at that and say, that no longer works. It's actually detrimental if you stay there. However, if that's part of your stage, and Paul is just as comfortable with that. I mean, there's a lot. I could list a lot of scriptures where Paul is actually saying it's okay. If you need, as a Jewish community, you need to be circumcised, that's fine. You need to go, you need to do these things, that's fine. I've become all things to all people, he says, in order to win some. So some could hear renunciation as I'm going to renounce food, I'm going to renounce wealth, I'm going to renounce property, comfort, all these things. And I'm going to go out into the desert and do what a lot of mystics have done in the past and see if I can accelerate my own spiritual development, right? And that's a mixed bag for a lot of folks. It really is. I've had folks who've done things like that and come back and they're just like, never again. And that didn't
work for me.
That did not work at all. And for others that it did work. And I think a lot of it is becoming aware of, for me, it's always about self-awareness. What is going on within you that's compelling you to do that? If for you, your desire is, I'm just trying to get out into the desert because, well, frankly, I'm pretty angry at the world right now.
Sure.
And I just want to sort of pull away.
It's what you don't believe in instead of I'm doing this
to get
closer
that's
to
a good
God.
way of saying it, yeah.
You're going away from something. I don't believe in that.
Yeah.
But I think
it's a reaction.
Right.
Yeah. But I do think that you just have to know, sort of like anticipate internally, what is my next step, on this journey? We're all on a spiritual journey. So what's my next step? What would help me to grow at this point? And I think with a good coach, with a good pastor, with a good, spiritual leader, they can kind of help you discern that. Like, it sounds to me like you're ready. This might be a good step for you. So yeah, go for it. And then see what happened as a result of that. So I think a lot of it is this dialogue, this conversation about how did that work for you? What happened here? So that way you can, you can continue to be intentional about your spiritual journey.
No, that's excellent. Okay, then we're on to principle number 10 is obedience. If your obedience is spontaneous, complete and natural, as the light is to the eye or smell is to the nose, then you come to God. And Christ is quoted directly here in Matthew 7:24. Christ says, "Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will compare him to a wise man who built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended and the winds blew and beat upon the house, and it fell not because it was built upon a rock." Those who heard the sayings of mine, of Christ, and does them, I will compare to a house on a rock. That is one analogy for being obedient to God's wish.
This is so interesting because on my way here, I was actually thinking about this verse of John 14, verse 6, where Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Right? No one comes to the Father but by me. And how that's been used by so many without any sort of, this part gets left unsaid, but it's assumed that what I am saying and how I'm interpreting this is the way, the truth, and the life. Not Jesus the person, but what I'm telling you as a pastor of this church becomes the thing that you have to obey. And I realized I was being pushed into some of this, and my reaction at times was very much there to push against a lot of that, because what I saw was some of it was abusive, some of it was very damaging to some people, and some of it was wonderful. And the parts that I reacted against, sometimes I reacted against the good parts, but I often also reacted against the negative parts. So I think it was helpful for me to finally understand that what is happening is oftentimes we are being told that obedience to God is actually obedience to another person. And there is a stage for that, for sure. And that stage happens generally when you're a child and you're learning to trust mom and dad and learning to just obey them. And it's also true at different points of our spiritual development, but it cannot be a stage that lasts forever. And the churches that I grew up in had that as a stage that lasts forever.
Sure. Keep people children.
You keep people children. Keep obeying that.
Sure.
Instead of teaching people to now tune in to the voice of God within that's guiding you and be obedient to that.
Yeah, become your own person that doesn't have to rely on another person to be obedient to. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so you were, as you look back on your life, Pastor, would you say that you have a pretty good discrimination now, that you learned obedience was not always appropriate because you were being obedient to some stuff that was not working for you and that you didn't feel like was true and possibly was really damaging and dangerous?
The realization of, yes, I did see some things that I don't think were very helpful to people.
Sure.
And so I did respond by saying, hey, no, this is abuse of power, and what you're doing is controlling someone else, and that's not good, and so when I called things out like that, of course, it never went over really well. But to now, at this point now, I would say, no, it's much more about not so much trying to tear down the voices that are, clamoring for obedience, but instead to tune in.
Yes, remain true to the voice you want to be obedient
to.
God's voice.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
And some of us say, well, that's so subjective and that you could follow your own whims. No, I'm not allowed to. If I'm really tuning into that internal voice, it's actually much more difficult to follow that than it was even to follow the outside voices. Yeah. Because it calls me to something that I really desperately hate to do, which is to sacrifice in certain ways.
Sure.
That every fiber of my being is screaming for, no, you need this, and I have to say, right now, I don't need this. What I need to do is be present for my son and my wife, and doing so is a death to that ego part, way harder than jumping through the hoops and doing the external obedient acts to serve a church or a pastor or another spiritual leader. Recently I remember having this experience. I was coming home from a wonderful vacation, and it just happened this past spring. And as I'm on the plane, I did this sort of intake. How am I doing as I'm coming home? Is there a desire to stay on on vacation, to remain there? No. Is there a desire to go home? Oh, I'm fine either way. Is there a desire to do anything? No, I'm good. And I found, because I was in that spot, that whatever was necessary to do at any moment, I was able to see it and respond to it.
That sounds pretty natural, Pastor.
And yeah, but that was just one moment.
That was just one moment on the plane.
And that was it. And then
the
it
plane
went.
landed and
then it was gone.
Oh, yeah, okay.
It lasted. It may have lasted, a couple of days, but that was a moment, a spiritual moment for me, and I knew it. I was very aware of what was happening. That this is unusual where I'm at, and but it involved a whole lot of self-denial leading up to that point, I think. And it was that, like, in the right ways, not denial in the wrong ways, because I self-deny in other ways that are actually unhealthy for me. But this was self-denial in the ways that I know are actually very healthy for me. So I was practicing that on vacation so that by the time I was heading home, for whatever reason, I had gotten to this place of real just openness and readiness to whatever the situation or the need that would arise, that I could respond in that obedient way, to whatever was the better thing to do, which would be the thing that God would want me to do, So it was a great place. I wish I could live there. It would be nice.
Okay, principle number 11, surrender. If your surrender to God is as wholehearted as that of one who, suffering from insomnia, surrenders to sudden sleep without a fear of being lost, then you will have God. And the quote from Scripture is Matthew 6:19, and Christ is saying, Lay not up for yourselves treasure upon earth, where moth and rust can corrupt, but where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust can corrupt, and thieves cannot steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
But I think about surrender as there, and I'm totally stealing this from an author that I absolutely love, and one of my most helpful writers. But he talks about how there comes a point in time when you first of all, and he takes us from Jacob, the story of Jacob in the Old Testament part of the Bible. And Jacob is very adversarial in his upbringing, or in his early years as he's grown up. He's adversarial. His fight is against the world around him. And then there comes a point where he has to face himself. And that is when he's about to face his older brother, Esau, with whom he's been at odds for a long time. And Esau wanted to kill him at one point, and he still thinks that Esau wants to kill him. And the story goes that there's an angel of God, or the apparition of God, comes to Jacob, and Jacob grabs a hold of this being and says, "Bless me. Don't go without blessing me."
He grabs hold of him.
Grabs hold of him.
Yeah.
And he wrestles with him, and then finally, and he won't let him go. Finally, the angel of God says to him, "What is your name?" And for the first time, Jacob has to actually say what his name really means. I mean, and of course in Hebrew, names have meanings. But the question of what is your name is not just this sort of like, so I know we've been wrestling like all night. I'd just like to get to know who, let's start over. Who are you? It's really the question of, we've been wrestling all night and now you're exhausted. Who are you?
Yeah, it really is, who are you? What is your name?
Yeah. And he has to say, I'm a deceiver. All my life, this has been my nature. And for the first time, he faces himself. And then there's this beautiful moment where God says, and this is after God has won the wrestling match technically, because he's apparently wrenched the hip out of joint, and says to Jacob, "You have wrestled with God and man, and you have overcome." And so the author says, your final battle, your final wrestling match is with the divine, and you must lose. And I remember reading that and thinking, that speaks at a deep level I don't even have words for. Because the wrestling does take place for a while with others. At times it's with ourselves. But there comes a moment where you realize all along you've been fighting the divine, you've been fighting God. And you have to lose. You have to surrender.
And then you get to go to your deep sleep naturally.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know of, I think of, stories of in my own life where that's been true, where I've had moments of just, okay, I'm tired. I can't keep battling this. And, you win.
Surrender.
And it's that, yeah.
Amen. Can't improve on that, which brings us to what is arguably the greatest principle, love. The final one, the 33rd principle, and the 12th one of 12 ways of realizing God. Love. If you have the love for God that St. Francis had for Jesus, then not only will you realize God, but you will please him. Yeah. That beautiful. So, from Scripture, 1 Corinthians 8, but if anyone loves God, that one is known by him. And then Mark 12:30 through 31, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the first commandment, and the second is like unto it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than this. Then in the Gospel of John 13, by this all will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. That's pretty straightforward. And finally, 1 John 4 says, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God. And he who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not yet know God, for God is love." So the greatest of these is love, Pastor.
Yeah.
So what do you say about love?
What is
What
there
do
to
you say about love, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't even know how to talk about that other than to say that if you were to take all of the world's religions and all of its teachings and all of its guidelines, and for those of us in this country, in America, who have been raised in some form of religion, undoubtedly there were certain rules, there were certain principles, there were certain guidelines, there were certain habits you had to engage in. And what I love about what Jesus teaches is he says you could take all 613 laws of the Old Testament and sum them up in one single commandment. And Paul does the same thing. Paul says, you love, you fulfill the entire law. That's the point of it. It was always pointing to love. But the problem is our capacity, our consciousness, our understanding of what love is limited. And the good news is that it can keep growing and keep expanding. And so some of these laws that were given for the very purpose of actually teaching people how to love better. That was the point. It was never one scholar says, the point of the law is not to look at it. It's to look through it and then see the divine. And yet so much of our work as religious preachers, teachers like myself, has been to really dissect the laws themselves and look at them and the teachings and to pass those on to the people. And now I look at them as the lens through which I'm looking through them to see what is it pointing to in terms of the loving God and loving neighbor. How is it helping in that way? So even in the world of the ancient world, Judaism and the Jews, the ancient Jews who were practicing these laws themselves, they were moving ahead of their counterparts of the ancient world then. They were moving forward because many of the laws were actually better than the laws of their of the surrounding cities and nations. And so that's the point of it, is to move people forward towards greater love. And so whenever someone ends up with this question of, well, Joel, what does the Bible say about this particular social hot button issue? They want a dogmatic answer. I tend to lean back into how are we being loving in this moment? That's the bigger question. What does it mean to love in this space right now? And if you can believe your doctrines in your views and still believe in a loving God, then hold on to them. But if they're not helping you to see God as more loving than you, that's the key thing. Is if the view, whatever doctrine you hold, and God sends people to hell and they burn eternally and eternal consciousness and all that, if you believe that and it helps you to see God as more loving than you, then hold on to it. Yes. But if it doesn't, then don't.
Yeah, let it go.
So I sat with a Muslim man, and I had dinner with him, and and he was wanting to test me to see, what kind of Christian am I, because he's been confronted by many. He's had many Christians try to convert him, and so he had a distrust already towards Christians. But we had begun to have this relationship, this friendship. And so he was kind of poking at me, and I didn't realize it immediately. I kind of started seeing it as it was happening. But he's poking me by asking me questions about the Quran and saying to me, do you believe in the Quran? What do you think about it? Why didn't you read it? And why do you think your way is the only way? And so on. And anyway, so I just said to him, if the Quran is helping you love God more and love your family more, then why would I ever tell you to stop reading it?
Oh.
And his response was, good answer. But I knew he was testing me. So we kind of laughed about it afterwards. But that's the point, I think, is it guiding you to greater love? So don't look at whatever it is that you are as this is permanent, but as a stage. If right now what I believe and what I'm holding on to and what I'm practicing is helping me to be loving, and it gives me a picture of the divine as being more loving than me, great. That's the stage. At some point, that should shift, because you are never at a point where you can say, I understand love and I live from perfect love. My love right now, it is based upon my awareness, my consciousness, my transformation. And so hopefully we're ever transforming and growing in deeper love. Yeah, and I think at some points we can see this. We can see people that get stuck in stages, and churches and denominations, and get stuck in a particular stage. And that stage that helped them to become at some point, maybe 100, 200, 300, 500 years ago, helped them to become what they are.
Yes, sir.
Be more loving within that culture at that time.
Right.
Has stopped at this point.
It no longer works.
Because we're ever growing and developing.
Spiraling.
Yeah, sure. Spiraling, exactly, yeah. Hopefully upward, not downward.
Well, listeners, that brings us to the end of this podcast. This is the end of the 6th episode. And that brings us to the end of the first season. There will be a second season. And I'd like to just really, from the depths of my heart, thank Pastor Joel for sharing his wisdom and life journey and the primacy of love with us. And if you wanted to share your work with people, Pastor Joel, how would they find out more about what you do? Well,
they can go to joelhubbard.com and look me up there on the website. And there are resources there that they can find that will take them to podcasts and other things that we've done. So that's a great place to start.
joelhubbard.com.
Yeah.
Very good. I'm really honored to have shared this conversation with you, Joel.
Thank you. Me too. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to give you a way to follow up, which is our website, befriendlyministries.org, and to give you the titles that are available to you if you choose to help us in this work. The first book available is Where Other Faiths Agree with Jesus. The second one is the actual compilation itself, the 33 Habits of Highly Effective Prophets. Then we have one about William Penn called Architect of Unity Between Christianity and Islam. That's what William Penn did. We have another book called Where Other Faiths Agree with Mayor Baba. There's another book, Where Other Faiths Agree with Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the Quakers. Then there's a workbook for your church or school to help you teach the 33 habits, which is called the Workbook of the 33 Habits of Highly Effective Prophets. And finally, we have a workbook and book that shows where all the 11 religions teach forgiveness and quotes from 11 different faiths on forgiveness. So again, that's befriendlyministries.org, and thank you so much for joining us.